Right, good morning everybody. If we could make a start please. First of all, can you hear me? Yes? Good. I'm not sure that I'll be able to hear you, but at least you hearing me is a start. So I've had apologies for absence from Councillors Rees, Cathcart, Robin Garrido, Lynn Holland and Azra Ali. Are there any further apologies? If not, Chair's announcements and urgent business. First of all, I'd like to welcome Councillor Shakil Ahmed, who's replaced Councillor Shah Wazir on the committee and also on the Capital Projects and Policy Subcommittee. So welcome, Shakil. Secondly, to say that there will be, at the conclusion of the formal agenda, there will be a presentation about the current state of play in relation to the formation by the rail industry of the May 2018 rail timetable. You'll recall that we had an update on this at our last meeting, and things, I hope, will have progressed further since then. So I'm hoping that we'll have a clearer idea by the end of today on what services, in particular Northern, are likely to be operating from May. And finally, just to remind those members like myself who are directors of the GMATL board that there will be a board meeting at the end of the rail presentation. So declarations of interest, those members like myself who are directors of GMATL will need to declare a prejudicial interest, and when we get to the item on the budget for this year, if there's any discussion on the line in there in relation to GMATL, then we'll need to withdraw from the meeting. Okay. And any other members who've got any other interest, declare them on the form in the usual way. Minutes of the meeting held on the 12th of January. Are those agreed as a correct record?
Agreed.
Any matters? No? Thank you. Subcommittee minutes. First of all, the Bus Network and TFGM Services Subcommittee held last Friday.
Move those, Chair.
Anyone wish to raise anything on those? Looks like you had a very good discussion about detailed matters and bus operations. Well done, thank you very much. Capital Projects and Policy Subcommittee of the 9th of February.
Move it.
Seems a long time ago because it was. And Metrolink and Rail Subcommittee on the 2nd of February. Any points on those? If not, can we move on to the Register of Key Decisions, which is for our noting. Unless anyone's got any questions? No, we'll note that then and move on to temporary bus stop closures. And I'll hand over to Howard to introduce this report. Can I just can I just say for the record, there are some cakes that are being distributed, and these have been baked by our committee clerk Jenny for us. So can we thank Jenny very much for providing us with some sustenance. Right, Howard.
Thank you, Chair. It's a short report which is proposing the introduction of a charging scheme for when we undertake temporary bus stop closures. As identified in the report, it's a service that we currently provide free to utility companies and for developers. So when there's a need to close a stop for some temporary works, TFGM attend that stop, put a temporary notice up. At the end of the works, they reopen the stop. Other authorities do charge for the works. The report is suggesting that we levy a charge of £100 per stop closure. The details are in 2.3 of the report. Financial implications from introducing this charge will produce around about £140,000 worth of income per year. That's based upon roughly about 2,000 stops which are closed annually. Next step, subject to approval of this committee, is that we start to apply the scheme from the 6th of May. We will give the necessary advance notice to utility companies and contractors, and we're in the process of actually detailing a service level agreement defining the service that we will provide to those utility companies. Happy to take any questions. Thank you, Chair.
Right, Councillor Corris, I think.
Thank you, Chair. Quite happy to approve this. It seems like a reasonable idea and it's falling into line with what other authorities are doing. I wondered what was going to happen to the money that was raised as a result of this charging programme, and I have a suggestion that perhaps we can use some of it, or all of it even, towards bus shelters. I know that we struggle to get them erected because the budget is not that large, and then there's lots of calls on that budget. It seemed a way of keeping the travelling public dry in some of the inclement weather we seem to suffer all the year round these days.
Thank you, Chair. I don't disagree with this. I think it's a really good idea, but can I just ask Howard? Can I just ask you, Howard, how does this compare to other local authorities in terms of the price that you're charging? Because it seems quite cheap to me. When you consider that in Manchester, if you want to suspend a pay and display bay or dispensation on a double yellow line, it's £30 a day. This, if I read it correctly, seems to be it's £100. You're charging to close it, and then you're charging later to open it again, I think, if I'm reading it right. But in between times, there's nothing. There doesn't seem to be any incentive to get on and do the work quickly. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, Chair. Partly a similar point. This talks about what we're going to charge. Can I ask what our costs are for doing this? It's all right charging, but what are our costs? And I think, like Noel, I'm of the view that a daily charge will keep people focused on getting them open, because my experience of temporary closures of bus stops, particularly from utilities, is they do them, and then we all go somewhere else and do something else for a week, and then we come back, and then we might go away again. Whereas if there was a daily charge, I think we'd have less temporary closures. In fact, I'm pretty certain we would. Thank you, Chair.
Chair, thanks, Chair. Again, a similar point to the colleagues. 2,000 stops per year, that's quite a lot of money we could generate, maybe on a month-to-month basis, where we can increase the charge if they're going longer than expected. I mean, it's noted in the report that you review it every so often. That's not good enough. They'll come and go when they're pleased for the sake of £100.
Thank you, Chairman. It's just to ask, how does this affect, I mean, we're talking about putting the price up, which is fine, utilities, but how does it affect charities that have a festival on, shall I say, and they have to move a bus stop? You know, they would have to pay the same price, I'm sure.
As a general principle, you ought never to confuse income with your budget process. So the idea that you should say, we've got this money, therefore we'll spend it on that, is just bad policy making. You get the money in, and then you put that into the pot with all the other competing demands, and you make a decision on the basis of the whole range of your requirements, rather than say, we've got this money, let's spend it on that. So as a general policy rule, that's not sensible. So I wouldn't agree that we use this money for anything other than place it in the pot of available funds to be bid for by all the things that we want to do as a transport authority. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think it mentions in the report that we ought to review it annually, and I think that review should consider not just all the points that people have made here, which are all important, but also what goes on in other authorities with a view to maximising this scarce source of revenue, because it's not very often that we get presented with something that gives us a source of income that we can use for other purposes that comes out of the blue. And whenever that happens, we ought to maximise the revenue that we've got so as to put more public transport out there on the streets of Greater Manchester. So I'd like us to look at all the suggestions that have been made about regular charges as opposed to ad hoc charges, but also look at the quantum of charge that other local authorities use with the view to maximising this unusual windfall source of revenue.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try and attempt to answer those in the order that were raised. Councillor Corris, a valid point you make in respect of shelters. We haven't actually got a shortfall of shelters at this moment in time. We haven't got a shelter outstanding list, so we're quite on top of it. In respect of the question you raised around funding of them, because it's a new asset, they would be funded from the capital programme, not from revenue expenditure. So I hope that addresses the points you've raised in respect of financing it.
I hate to interrupt, Chair, but may I just come back on that one point? You say you've got no bus shelters outstanding. When my husband was a member of this committee 3-4 years ago, he made a request for a shelter that hasn't been actually implemented, so maybe it needs looking at.
I'll pick it up outside the meeting. There might be a reason why it didn't hit the patronage levels, but I'll definitely have a look at that and take it outside the meeting, if that's okay. Councillor Bailey, yes, we did look at costs of other authorities, and they vary quite considerably. Quite a few authorities do not charge for it at all. They just leave contractors free will to actually put the notices up. The closest authorities, Liverpool charge £125, but they actually outsource it to the contractor, so it's probably an additional cost that's incurred as a result of that. Warrington Council charge between £75 and £150, depending on the level of notice period given. So if they're given quite a lengthy notice period, it'll be £75 per stop closure. The closest to ourselves, who operate a very similar system, is Strathclyde, and they operate a system of £100 per stop closure, which is what we're trying to replicate. Just for point of clarity, we're actually saying £100 per stop closure and opening. So it's a one-off charge for it. In respect to the questions raised by Councillor Sykes, our costs are in the region of £80 for undertaking that type of work, to put a labour out there to actually attend and close a stop. On top of that, there will be an administration fee as well to deal with the back office payment side of invoicing. I think that the questions that have been raised generally around trying to accelerate it and how do we actually manage the closures. This is more about us actually levying a charge for the works that we're undertaking. It's not a charge for monitoring and make sure the works are closed within a relevant timescale. That's done through the GMRAP system, and that process needs to be used fully for making sure that relevant permits are applied for and timescales are adhered to as part of that process. This is more about making sure that there's an income stream for the works that we generate and undertake when we're actually posting the information up there. But it's a fair point that we do need to make sure through GMRAPs that the works are being closely monitored and that they don't go beyond the time they're supposed to. And GMRAPs is supposed to avoid multiple visits from multiple different utilities attending at the same time and different times. Thank you, Chair. Sorry, Councillor Dickinson. Events we have purposely excluded from this charge. So anything that would be charity-based, any events such as marathons, we've excluded from the charging regime.
Right, thank you very much. So, with those comments being noted for consideration when the review takes place, can we accept the proposals? Thank you very much. And that takes us on to the bigger question of the transport levy and budget for the forthcoming year 18-19. Mr Warrener.
Thank you, Councillor Fender. The report updates the committee on the transport levy budget. Members will be aware that the transport levy was submitted to and approved by the Combined Authority at the end of January. The report sets out a very similar level of detail that was provided to members of the Combined Authority following the budget scrutiny process that was undertaken during the back end of last year and early this year. The report also requests approval for a number of things. Firstly, a proposed increase in bus station departure charges of 2p, which equates to around about 3.2%. It also asks for agreement of changes in local link and school fares in line with RPI. Members may recall that last year was the first year that we'd increased those fares for approximately 6 years. Items 4 and 5, in addition to member colleagues, I also need to declare an interest as a member of the GMATL board. However, the report notes the budget that was approved by the CA by way of a grant for GMATL of 4.3 million, and also section 413 of the report sets out some proposed changes to ring and ride fares after April 2018. Very happy to take questions on the report, noting, as Councillor Fender said, that any debate around GMATL will not be able to involve myself or other member colleagues who are directors of GMATL.
Right, thank you very much. Any questions or points on this? Annette.
Page 4.2, or is that the next section?
It's the next one.
I'm looking at paragraph 3.2, page 4. Are questions for that open now?
Yes, certainly, yeah.
Yes. Okay, so I was reading this. I'm querying the item of the application for £56 million from HM Treasury. This seems a very large amount of money. I just wondered what it was intended to cover. I mean, I know you explain in the paragraph, but if you could talk me through it a bit, just help me understand, please.
Certainly, Councillor. So you'll be aware that we have delivered a substantial majority of the Greater Manchester Transport Fund 1, as known colloquially. We had been involved in discussions with government officials around seeking substantial funding from them to support the development of a Transport Fund 2, as known colloquially, and requested that in addition to the funding that the Combined Authorities released through reserves to enable us to develop schemes, the government should also be asked to contribute some significant sums towards that. They didn't. They certainly didn't in the autumn budget, and nor did they again in the spring statement of this week. So where we are is really in paragraph 3.3, which is that leaders have agreed to the release of further reserves to enable us to develop a number of schemes. What it clearly means is that we will be able to do less development work, given that we've got a relatively small amount compared to what we would have had government given us £56 million, which was over a period of 3 years. 4 years, apologies, 4 years.
Okay, thank you.
So this is associated with a large amount of... So the Transport Fund just is for the work to pay for the people who are carrying out the work, looking at the projects and the business cases and the feasibility?
Oops, sorry. The funding that we'd asked for from government and the funding that we have received from the Combined Authority is about scheme development. It's not about delivering schemes into the ground.
So this obviously with the GMSF in particular, there's a lot of work going on. A lot of the boroughs are asking for business cases to be looked at in a large way. So was the response from government in terms of why no revenue was given?
Certainly not officially, but I think it is probably no different to the reason why lots of other requests for revenue funding weren't afforded to GM and other localities. What the government did announce was a Transforming Cities Fund, which is a capital fund, and there will be a report going to leaders in that regard at the end of this month. But that was purely capital, not revenue. So to develop schemes to the point where there is a business case that is almost substantially, if not exclusively, needs revenue funding rather than capital.
Thanks, Chair. Steve, a question on the Ring and Ride service. 4.13 is an increase with up to a 30p increase as from April. It does mention that it went out to consultation. Can you say how many people was consulted? And with the new fare increase, can we say, how are you going to advertise this fare increase to the people?
On the basis that I'm allowed to answer that question, Off the top of my head, Councillor Burke, I genuinely can't remember the number of people, but I can certainly get you that number. It was the consultation involved going and speaking to user groups in all the respective areas where Ring and Ride is used. In terms of communicating the fares increase, I would suggest and also look to member colleagues as co-directors of GMATL that it's something that I would be surprised if we didn't talk about, subject to this committee excuse me, approving the recommendations. How we communicate that to users, both actual and potential, is something that we will discuss today at the GMATL board meeting. But it absolutely needs to be done. Accept.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or points? If not, can we accept the recommendations? I'll just ask Guy to move the recommendation 5, since that's one that I have declared a prejudicial interest in.
I shall move that.
Okay, thank you all very much. So, developing the 2040 strategy. We have the benefit of Mr Warburton, Simon Warburton, to come and talk us through where the work on this vital prospectus is going.
Thank you, Chair. So members will recall that in early 2017, February 2017, the 2040 Transport Strategy was endorsed and published as Greater Manchester's new local transport plan. What the report looks to do here is to provide a summary of the work that's been underway over the past 12 months to look to progress the strategy through a series of different work streams, which of course starts with the delivery of the existing capital programme within Greater Manchester, which we set out in the 2040 strategy. Beyond that, there has been significant work undertaken with colleagues from each of the 10 local authorities to look at a forward pipeline of investment now to support the 2040 strategy. And the first priority of that pipeline is to ensure complementarity with the growth agenda that Greater Manchester has set out and will be pursuing through the spatial framework. But in addition, we've also been working closely with government to look at the long-term implications of the arrival of high-speed rail in Greater Manchester. And just this morning, the Mayor published our HS2 growth strategy document, which sets out how we want to achieve those broader growth and sustainability and also inclusion objectives of the 2040 strategy through the arrival of HS2. We've also carried out a number of pieces of work with Transport for the North, looking to ensure that their work on pan-northern connectivity, particularly through initiatives such as the North West Quadrant study and the development of Northern Powerhouse Rail, fits fully with the Greater Manchester agenda. And then there are specific areas of strategy development that we've seen come forward within Greater Manchester over the past 12 months, including the Mayor's congestion conversation and the work towards a new congestion plan, the work to progress the air quality plan and to respond to the specific clean air requirements that have now been placed on Greater Manchester. And then there's a large body of work, which was of course just referred to in the dialogue before, around future scheme development. And that's very much a priority for both TFGM and our colleagues in local authorities, ensuring that we have robust business cases in place to continue investment in Greater Manchester into the 2020s. All of that work is now coming together, and we will look to publish an updated delivery plan against the 2040 strategy in the summer, so that the general public and our wider stakeholders are fully aware of how we're looking to move the agenda forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So, yes.
Just briefly, Mr Chairman, I should declare a personal non-prejudicial interest in all matters relating to HS2. Thank you.
Okay, any others? Yes, Patricia.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to say that, excuse me, I have had a cold, that I'm delighted that that the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework and the Transport Strategy are working together, mutually supportive documents, because the spatial framework that came out was weird and wonderful in some areas that there was absolutely no possibility without knocking other houses down to build houses in that area. So I'm pleased to see that they will work closely together, and I would like, probably won't be here in 2040, but I'd like to see reports come back to see how it's progressing. That would be really important to a lot of the different boroughs.
Yes, and thank you for those words of support. There has been very close work, both between the core teams working at a Greater Manchester level and also through a regular forum with senior district officers that I chair, that brings together both spatial planning and transport planning to carry forward one agenda in Greater Manchester. Again, as part of the publications around the delivery plan, we will set out more in terms of how that work is coming together. So hopefully councillors will find that useful, and obviously I'll be very happy to come back to the committee and explain that further at that point.
Thank you. I think you've got a bit of a poison chalice with that one, but good luck with it all the same.
Yes, Mike.
I know we tend to think of the big things in any sort of strategy like this, but one of the biggest areas for improvement is in design standards, in terms of junctions, in terms of bus stops, in terms of things like this that currently are adding to congestion, but we've hardly any real spend, but except in terms of design standards that actually meet 21st century travel, could make a big difference when they're due for renewal anyway.
Yeah, and that's a very important point that Councillor Cordingley makes, and is one of the focuses of activity through the Streets for All work that we talk about within the report here. And we're very hopeful that we're now going to agree some consistent design standards with districts that will allow us to both future-proof the transport system and also ensure that we can both support a sustainable travel agenda whilst also supporting the efficient movement of traffic through junctions. Absolutely.
Thanks, Chair. This is clearly a working document and should remain so. One of the remarks made by a colleague prior to in the pre-meeting was that already the pace of change across the piece in transport is remarkably rapid. And just to urge it even faster, I'd like to refer to the public health reports for the public health officer for Stockport, who included a chapter about Hyperloop, which would actually, if introduced, obviously at the latter end of the period we're talking about, get around the very struggling productivity issues faced in particular by the rail industry in this locality.
So I won't dwell on one particular technology today, Chair, but again, within the report we talk about how we are very active now looking at a range of different areas of new mobility across the city region, and that spans from some relatively lower level activities through initiatives such as the City Verve programme, which is currently underway and which has been looking to make use of modern internet technology to better help people to intuitively navigate their way around the city. We are looking at how some of the new models of transport delivery can be embraced in Greater Manchester, and of course a good example of that this year has been the introduction of the mobike service. And then of course absolutely there are some larger technologies which we will continue to watch with interest.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. A few things, Simon. First of all, the North West Quadrant study. I'm only laughing because people keep talking about the North West Quadrant study. Half the people don't know what it means, and those who do know what it means can never see an end to the process. So I just wondered if you could see an end to the process, because this North West Quadrant study, whatever else it's supposed to be doing, it's supposed to be telling us where new roads and motorways may be going, you know, in Greater Manchester or in our case in the northwest of England. And I can never find any explanation of. I know who's kind of running the show, but I can't see any paperwork that tells me exactly what they're looking at and when, you know, when there's going to be any conclusion on air quality. Or congestion and air quality, I think it's fair to put the two together. You mentioned, I mean, the way I read members of Parliament is they want local authorities to have powers, but they don't want to do anything because what they might want to do is rather unpopular. So they think it's a good idea if local authorities have air quality action zones, which will upset motorists and so on. But they've no intention of upsetting motorists, have they? By the sound of it, because everything I've read from members of Parliament are saying give local authorities the job, even though local authorities have lost 50% of their budgets in the last 7 years. So the question is, really on air quality, are we going to make attempts to actually get the government to do something on air quality as opposed to passing it over to local authorities to do something? On employment, if you read the spatial framework, there are not loads of employment. You know, in other words, where the investment and the jobs are going to be in Greater Manchester over the next, you know, till 2040, there are not dozens of places in Greater Manchester. In fact, it comes down to 6 or 7 that are itemised. So if we're running transport, we've got to get people to the jobs, and to rely on the motorway network to get them there isn't a very good idea, as soon as the motorway network tends to be jammed for most of the peak times. So Metrolink is one obvious way that you know, we've got to try and make sure that Metrolink in the future is taking people to and from work, I would have thought. And I may miss some of these out, but the areas I remember was Manchester City Centre, Manchester Airport, Trafford Park, Port Salford, Media City. I've missed one out in Bury, the Bury, whatever it's called. But anyway, there was 2 or 3 other areas. But I mean, I think it's. I don't see how we can have a transport strategy if we don't tell people how they can get to and from work, which is, you know, what a lot of people want to do. I think I'll leave it at that, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So to start with the North West Quadrant, to explain to members first of all, there is a section of the M60 motorway which I'm sure members will be familiar with, which is also part of the M62. It runs effectively from Rochdale through to the Eccles interchange. And that is the busiest section of motorway in the country outside of the M25. And so it's been identified as a priority issue to be looked at between ourselves, Transport for the North, Government and Highways England as the managers of the motorway. In the very long term, Highways England are studying at the moment whether infrastructure is needed broadly within the alignment of the motorway or whether a different alignment is needed in order to provide capacity in order to deal with effectively the 2 sets of roles that part of the motorway is playing. That work is progressing, but it is a very significant piece of work, and therefore it is going to take some time to progress. What we have put in place are forums, regular planning forums, with representatives from each of the local authorities along the alignment so that our colleagues in local authorities are aware of the thinking of Highways England, and so that local issues are also being fully considered within that longer term planning process. But perhaps more importantly, we're also looking to ensure that the strategy is not simply about a very large scheme a long way in the future, but rather what we can achieve through the next 5 years and the 5 years after that through the corridor, to improve some of the problems that we've seen, particularly for communities in parts of Salford who live up against that part of the motorway and experience problems now through that section and not just in the future. With regard to the air quality issues, yes, government has mandated parts of Greater Manchester to have to address specific air quality problems to a given timescale, and that's presenting a real challenge for us, particularly because of the resource issues that Councillor Jones alluded to before. To credit government, they have given us additional resources to help to support the planning process, to understand what's needed, and we have been very clear with government from the outset that what will be needed is a multimodal package of measures, and the investment will be substantial in order for us to be able to address our air quality problem, and therefore we are making sure that the ask that we develop at government will be a very clear and significant ask of government. And then in terms of the final point around access to employment, it's a very good point. We shouldn't overlook the fact that locally large numbers of Greater Manchester's residents continue to work within and near to their own communities, but we do have a modern trend of clustering, particularly in terms of a number of our better paid employment activities. And one of the jobs of bringing together land use planning and transport planning is so that we can be very clear in terms of where we're planning for clusters of employment in the future and put the right links in place. In part, that will be new transport links, and so within the report we talk about work that we're undertaking around rapid transit at the moment to see where can we make a business case that the committee and the combined authority and the mayor can then come behind to ask for capital investment from government in additional parts of a rapid transit system. But in other parts, it will be around how do we use that overall integration toolkit that we've talked about and secured through devolution to allow people to move around a transport network in Greater Manchester and to use that as the way in which we bring down some of those barriers that people perceive at the moment in terms of being able to reach opportunities across the conurbation.
Just to remind Roger, the one he forgot about was Logistics North, which abuts to the Salford boundary. And if I may make a plea, I can't think of anywhere in the conurbation more suitable for a tram train system that would serve Logistics North than the pretty ropey Aberton line.
Simon, can I just sort of probe a bit more on the M60 quadrant that Roger's raised? Because you mentioned 5 to 10 years. Does that mean that the M60 quadrant is likely to come off somebody's wish list onto something concrete? Because one of the things that one of the routes which was supposed to be for the M60 quadrant was from the M58 junction with the M6 across the M61 and then split across from there to the M62, cutting out the necessity of driving down towards Eccles, as you mentioned, and going through the concrete tunnels with the M60, which joins the M60 at this present point in time. The problem is there doesn't appear to be much joined-up thinking. Let me use the dreaded phrase, Peel Holdings. Peel Holdings are potentially will have a great influence on the route or alignment of that route unless somebody comes off the fence and gives a definitive answer. So please can you tell me, do we have a definitive line yet? Because Peel clearly around Checkmate Roundabout, which was one of the options to come through, are currently have got a planning appeal which they've got approved from the planning inspectorate, which in fact is going to be built over that line. And I don't see how there's any joined up thinking on this one.
So the work over the next 12 months moves from the assessment of a short list of options now, which includes the option that Councillor Chadwick described before, through to the identification of a preferred option. So by the end of 2018-19, the intention of DFT and Highways England is that they will have reached a conclusion in terms of what they consider to be the best option, which then they can start to take forward through the next spending period for Highways England in development terms, and they can start the process of whether it's then identified as a investment in the period after that.
Can I ask you to use your crystal ball and say it?
So with a very fair wind, and we are talking about a piece of infrastructure that will ultimately have to compete with a lot of other investment decisions at a national level, they are looking at a development period through what's termed the RIS2 period, that's 2020 to 2025, and if a fair wind was behind the scheme and it was then carried forward as a priority, it could become an investment in the ground in the second half of the 2020s.
Okay, if there are no more, can we thank Simon very much for that update? And I'm sure many of you will look forward to receiving more information as this unfolds. This takes us on to the next item, which is to do with rail franchising and the West Coast Partnership, with some reference also to East Midlands trains and cross-country. Carolyn.
Thank you, Chair. This is a short paper to inform members of our work to date and ask them to endorse our approach to influencing bidders for forthcoming rail franchise renewals, particularly West Coast Partnership. This now makes the Intercity West Coast operator a partner in the development of HS2, which is something that we have strongly fought for and endorse. I don't intend to go through the paper in any more detail, but full consultations for each of these franchise renewals, our full consultation responses are available on request. And I'd just like to briefly say that we're also presenting on the state of play for May 18 at the end, and we'll be happy to take any in-principle questions. But if any individuals have longer questions or would like us to talk to us in more detail about May 18, we're happy to discuss them either after the meeting, time permitting, or back at the office if you would like to talk about them separately with us. Thank you, Chair.
Right, thank you very much. Anyone got any detailed points or questions? Yes, Stuart.
Thank you. It's about the priorities for the West Coast franchise. I'm obviously pleased that Bolton has been recognised, but I think I would have liked to have seen a bit more more ambitious project than just one train per day. But what I'm a little bit confused about is the reference to the Wigan. That says Wigan North Western should be served by one train per hour. The services to Scotland should be coordinated with the Transpennine Express services to Scotland to provide 2 trains per hour to Glasgow and 1 train per hour to Edinburgh. When, you know, hopefully from December, the Transpennine services to Scotland from Manchester Airport are going to be diverted, are going to be rerouted by the Bolton corridor. Does this mean that TFGM are anticipating them going back to the Wigan corridor?
Okay, I'll answer this one. A little bit of this is coming up in my presentation a bit later on. The services will still be rerouted via the Bolton corridor by the end of this year, but we have to do that when the electrification scheme has been delivered. So there will be an interim period following May 18 when these still will go via Wigan.
brief question. It's not really addressed to Stuart because I know he takes a wider view. But really, when we talk about the Bolton corridor, the Wigan corridor, we've got to remember that in each of our individual districts, people use other elements in the transport system as well as our own. So lots of people to the east of Bolton use the Metrolink from the Bury side. And equally, if you live on, as I have done for many years, on the western side of Bolton, the Wigan corridor is very, very much more useful in terms of getting down to London, for example, in time for early meetings. So it's very important that we look across the piece and not just say, well, I represent Bolton, therefore it's the Bolton corridor. People from Bolton use the Metrolink if they live on the Braitmit, that side of Bolton, and very much people who live on the western side of Bolton regard the main rail service as going through Wigan.
Okay, yes, Annette.
Thank you. I just, how would, in the priorities for the West Coast franchise, there's a questionnaire, and response to questionnaire lies behind it. How do I access that information? It referred more detail for the fares offer can be found in our response to question 6, pages 34 to 36. Where can I find that?
Yeah, if you just contact us after the meeting, we can supply you with full consultation responses if you want them.
Okay.
There's nothing in the report about increasing prices on today. In this, is anything? No?
I don't have any specific information today. As I said, you can have the full consultation response as it is at the moment, and we are working with bidders on every aspect of the ITT.
Yeah, it's a similar question. We've seen year on year massive increases in prices on the West Line. Can we maybe put something into the franchise where we may be able to freeze the prices or not?
We will absolutely use our influence as much as we can, but we are influencing these franchises, we're not dictating them. So we can ask the question, yes.
Okay, well, if there are no others, can we thank Carolyn and Owen for answering the points that have been raised? Okay, thank you very much. Which takes us to the exclusion of press and public. Could someone move the appropriate resolution? That's agreed. Thank you.